Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
Over the past 6 weeks, we've been taking a good close look at intelligent design. I'll admit, I was hesitant to get into this topic in the first place. I polled the discussion group over a year ago about whether to get into this or not, and I got a very lukewarm response at the time, so I just set that episode idea aside at the time. But the problem of intelligent design kept rearing its ugly head. It's a topic that comes up often in apologetic discussions of faith versus science. And then half a year ago, another listener asked us to watch and comment on a YouTube video that featured 3 prominent ID advocates making their pitch for intelligent design. This listener is a very well-educated person himself, although not in the biological sciences, and a very critical thinker, and he said, this is in his email, he wrote, "It's a bit mind-blowing, given the complexity of the conversation by 3 quite esteemed, highly credentialed academics. In my humble opinion, it's worth investing the time." And I did watch it and commented with the listener privately, but I still didn't think I should do it as an episode for our audience, again, given that lukewarm reception to the idea a year ago. But then 2 months ago, one of the most prominent ID advocates, Stephen Meyer, was a guest on Joe Rogan's podcast. The Rogan Experience boasts a viewership of 11 million people per episode, and Stephen talked to that audience for 2 hours about intelligent design. And I listened to that interview, and I sat back, and then I channeled my inner Rafiki from The Lion King, and I said, it is time. We got to do this. This is still such a hot and current topic in the evangelical community, even if some of us think personally this is just so old.
Yeah, I agree. It is, I think, still a very relevant topic. And I think there's been this shift in the evangelical world from that kind of hardcore creationism, 6,000-year-old earth and de novo kind of creation and so on, to ID, to intelligent design. I find a lot of evangelical thinkers and just people that I know find this as kind of the solution to the evolution, problem as they see it, right?
Right.
Because it is, as opposed to the first wave of creationism, it is much more sophisticated, and the people advocating it are highly credentialed, like you mentioned. And unlike the initial wave, I remember seeing Duane Gish. Duane Gish was one of the main proponents of the in that initial wave of creationists, and it was really kind of, frankly, it was laughable, And actually, even in his presentation, he had pictures of cows emerging from the water, like things like this, just kind of mocking and making fun. And then you find out that, he himself, he's an engineer. I think Morris, the other big advocate at the time, he was an engineer, I believe, as well.
Right.
No real training in the biological sciences or anything like that. But the ID movement, these folks, like Michael Behe, they are well-trained and highly credentialed. And so you do take them more seriously. And I think a lot of Christians have felt that, this is the comfortable option. This is the safe option, that I can.
Right.
But it's kind of curious because there's a lot of things about that option that kind of really, like common ancestry, as an example, that I find surprising that so many have been willing to embrace.
Huh. Wow.
Yeah.
So we reached out to Michael Behe, one of the ID advocates represented in that video that our listener had me look at, and we got his version of ID with the usual and expected emphasis on the bacterial flagellum as the best example of irreducible complexity, even though Michael hasn't done any work on anything like the flagellum. And then we checked with 3 world-class experts on the bacterial flagellum, scientists who have spent decades studying that one particular nanomachine using the most sophisticated research techniques and equipment available to modern science, and they gave us quite a different story. And then we brought in another high-profile ID advocate, Jonathan MacLatchie, to talk some more about various aspects of intelligent design ideology, including what this design, this guided evolution might look like, the actual mechanics behind how the designer works. And we got vague references to periodic injections of new genetic information into the biosphere and sudden introductions of entirely new species without any data or evidence to back that up, while the 3 scientific experts talked in detail, perhaps too much detail, I feel that was our technically most challenging episode ever. They talked in detail about the studies that have been done and the genetic mechanisms that explain the data we're getting, at least in part at this stage. And they presented a mechanism that featured an RNA repair enzyme morphing into a primitive protein pump, and then that morphing on the one hand into a generator, an enzyme that makes energy called ATP, and on the other hand, more specialized protein pumps, which then became the base of a whip-like propeller called the flagellum, as well as a hypodermic needle-like weapon to inject toxins called the injectosome.
Yeah, these were, deep episodes, scientifically speaking, which I was fascinated to be part of the little part that I was able to play. However, for myself, I can say, and I'm sure for some of our listeners, that they were definitely challenging, but I think you got the drift. You got the gist of it. And I think one of the things that I've learned from the series in particular is that when you're a non-specialist in an area and you read somebody who is a specialist, let's say, and they have a particular opinion and they bring to it their specialist language and so on and so forth, it can be very convincing because you don't know the questions to ask. You don't know if they're leaving things out and so on. So I've read a number of Behe's books and so on. And when you're not a biologist, it can be very, very convincing. But then you hear these guys talk and you realize, oh, there's a lot of other ways of looking at this. And,
exactly.
But I don't know, though, I'm not going to know that as a layperson. Right. So I think one of the tricky things is that sometimes in the area of science in particular, or maybe in a lot of areas, there's a certain amount of, I guess, trust, from a layperson's perspective. You have to trust that you're reading good information, that these people are legit and giving you all sides of a story and so on. And I don't know exactly how you do that completely, except that, that's where debate comes in, I think, because in fact, doing what we did, I think, is really a service, because we have really tried to be fair and bring in both sides and let listeners, come away with what they think.
Right. So, Scott, when you went into this, it sounds like you were at least open, at least willing to listen to the ID people, if not leaning in that direction.
Right.
And then did that change? How did it change after we talked to the experts?
Yeah, that absolutely. I have had an interest in the ID movement for many years, because thinking that maybe this is a viable alternative, a different way of looking at things. And these guys are obviously challenging the scientific status quo, and that's that difficult thing to do. So I've had a generally favorable, but I've always had some real deep questions as well about it. And having listened to the series, I would say, those some of those questions have been, I think, answered. Like the flagellum issue, for example. I thought the responses on that were cogent and made sense. That I can see how things may have come together in pieces, right? So I think overall it has definitely made me feel less positive about the ID movement, in the sense that it seems to me that they're holding more back than maybe I had thought. They're not sharing. They're not self-critical in a way, they're not really sharing very much the things that are a real challenge for them,
Right.
So a little more disingenuous than maybe I had thought in the beginning.
Interesting.
Yeah.
We'll talk in a few minutes about our perceptions of them, but that's interesting.
Yeah.
As for myself, I went into this series, as I said in the very first episode, I said I almost felt like I had to embrace ID, because if you believe in a creator God, you almost have to believe it. But on the other hand, after seeing and hearing the scientific evidence, that very compelling story of nanomachines morphing into other nanomachines, it almost seems instead that I have to reject the idea of a creator, or maybe even the whole idea of God in general. But then when I was thinking about that, didn't know, what am I going to do with this? I was thinking about it over the past, 6 weeks, and I was sitting by the pond in my backyard trying to figure out where I am now on the topic, and a thought occurred to me. So, Scott, have you ever listened to a strange song like the Beatles doing Revolution 9 on the White Album? Or looked at a Picasso, and in either case, or anything like this, you just sit back and say, what's that about?
Sure, absolutely. Which is, of course, what makes those works so intriguing.
And what is it that makes them so intriguing?
Well, I think that they're not straightforward. They like I'm a lover of literature. I read a lot of literature, and I'm a film buff as well. And the thing that makes for me a great novel is subtlety. Things where it's just not preaching at me.
Right.
I have to participate. I have to get in there, and and that of course makes me take the journey and feel the things that are going on and so on.
Right.
And that is, to me, that's what great art does. That's what great
Right.
art. And yeah.
So that's you're getting along the same lines of thinking that I was on at that time sitting by the pond. I was thinking that an artist can do a painting or write a poem, a song, one that's intended to trigger a cascade of thoughts and questions and emotions
Right.
in the person enjoying that art. But there's no guarantee that people will be able to make sense of it or be able to decipher the so-called original meaning that the artist intended, if there is
Right.
such an original meaning. Instead, the artist just creates the conditions that might lead to some people coming up to some kind of a meaning. The school system that teaches our kids can only create the conditions for learning, but there's no guarantee that learning will happen, let alone the intended learning. And so here, in the same way, I was thinking, couldn't we just say that there's a creator, or at least a creative life force, that just creates the initial conditions, that just sets the stage for complexity to happen all by itself, with all the risks of bad things happening as well as good things, however you define good or bad here.
For sure. And it's interesting, it really bothers theologians, or some, not all, but some theologians, that, for example, in the story of Noah, for example, we have this dialogue presented with God being quite surprised by what he's created, by being quite taken back, by how evil man has become, and in fact even saying that he regrets the thing.
Right. Yeah.
That kind of, in a way, evokes, I think, what you're saying. It's almost like God has, like you're saying, there's this initial condition, and then he's kind of watching this thing too, with he can actually be genuinely. And I know for a lot of theologians out there maybe listening, that's very troublesome, because God knows all, and so on. And we won't get into that end of the discussion. But the point is, there seems to be a delight. God is presented as somebody who's delighted and intrigued even with his creation, right? With how this thing is kind of on. And the other issue is freedom.
Right.
That if a creator wants to have another being that they can commune with and have a loving relationship with, that has to happen in a free way. It can't happen by building a bunch of robots who worship you. That's
right.
I think of Kim Jong-un in North Korea or whatever. I mean, I don't know what these psychotic people or these psychopaths get. Like, what does he get out of watching 100,000, that he knows he has brainwashed and coerced into worshiping him? It's sick, right? And I don't think that God would get any joy from that. But watching a creation unfold, and eventually creatures come into the ability to love and come into that is really, I think, a fascinating way to look at it. So yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. And for the listeners who are fairly new to the podcast, say since the past 1 year, we did a long mini-series of episodes a couple of years ago, roughly 20 episodes that grew out of one interview, one that we did with Dr. Chris Berger, talking about the cosmic egg with an intended goal, which was to explode and produce agape-capable beings. So if you haven't already heard these episodes, I recommend you go back to them. It starts at number 64 and goes all the way up to number 86. But that having been said, I just want to add for the record that I went into the series not quite settled on my position on intelligent design, but having had our conversations with two of the leading ID proponents and with scientists who gave an expert's perspective on many of the subjects those proponents based their arguments on, I'm so very much convinced it's not a worldview I can hold. And my main reason for saying that is the observation that we refer to in almost every conversation, the observation of apparently malevolent design. If one is going to insist that there was a designer who was directly guiding the evolution of life on Earth, identifying evolutionary speed bumps or even roadblocks and helping life over those, then that designer was equally in a position to identify evolving designs that would cause much cruelty and suffering and death, like the convergence of the food pipe with the windpipe, or forcing babies to first squeeze through a pelvic opening barely big enough for its head. In this case, you can't have your cake and eat it too. What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, it's interesting as you're talking, Luke. In a certain sense, this is similar to the moral dilemma of the problem of evil, the problem of moral evil. So questions like, well, why didn't God stop the Holocaust? I'm a big history buff, particularly World War II fascinates me. And I think, was it 9 attempts on Hitler's life? And he escaped them. It was uncanny. In fact, every time he escaped it reinforced in him that he was destined, to be Germany's Führer, because some of them he walked away from a podium in one case and, through a minute later, or that even been seconds, the thing blew up, he kept escaping. And you think, well, gee, God, what, why couldn't that have ended right there? Maybe the Holocaust could have been avoided. So, there's no doubt that I think, just empirically, that God is present, sure, but he's absent too. He is. It seems he's a pretty hands-off God, and I know that creates real dilemmas for theology, but I don't think it can be ignored. I think we have to grapple with that, and I think I think one of the flaws in the ID thing is it tries to, in too simplistic ways, explain God's ways to men. That this is, you said earlier that, how can you be a Christian and not believe in design? Well, I kind of agree with that in a certain sense, that in the big picture, I do believe there is somehow some sort of explanation, maybe, or maybe design, but it is certainly doesn't seem for us to know. From this side of the picture, and like the Apostle Paul said, we see through a glass darkly. So to try to look at nature and then pick out certain things and say, well, that proves it, it just doesn't seem very effective.
Yeah. Scott, I wonder if you're confusing the words meaning and design. I think things can have meaning and not have been designed.
That's interesting.
And of course, the other way around, you can design something and it doesn't have meaning.
It's possible, but that's a good point. Although I do still think that there's, just because we don't understand a design or doesn't mean there isn't one. I guess that's my point.
Okay,
right?
All right.
You can look at things and say, boy, that I can't see how that could ever have been designed to be that, and then discover later that there were. So I guess that's what I'm saying is that we're limited in our understanding, right?
Sure.
And so I guess my problem with the ID movement, in a sense, is that they're trying to force a particular understanding of design and look for it in nature. And they admit, I think, Michael Behe, for example, certainly believes in common descent. And so how do you, my issue there is, well, then if you believe that evolution does occur, and we do, and you believe in common descent, then why do we need to punctuate it here and there with this divine intervention, of design? I that's the part I find mystifying. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It was ironic, getting back to the point about, this malevolent design and you can't have your cake and eat it too. I found it ironic that the ID advocates have latched onto the bacterial flagellum as their signature mascot, the best example of a sophisticated nanomachine which requires the existence of a designer. But then one of our science experts pointed out that it's the bacterium that uses the flagellum to mediate disease and death in humans. So,
yeah.
So not only did these interviews help me solidify my position on intelligent design in the direction of putting it behind me, but it also left me with certain feelings about the ID movement and its leaders. And I have to say they're not warm and fuzzy feelings. I want to share some of these, but I want to first emphasize that I'm not simply mudslinging here. Instead, I did notice several generalities about their tactics and their worldview that are not positive in my view, and I think they're worth talking about. So the first thing that annoys me is that despite their denials, this is still a God of the Gaps worldview. ID is basically William Paley's watchmaker thesis all over again. Would you agree, Scott?
Yeah, I think nuanced, with some new angles for sure. But at the end of the day, it seems to be. And when we asked that question directly, didn't feel like got a particularly satisfying answer.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that designer is just simply code for God.
Right.
But that God doesn't have to be the Judeo-Christian God. It could be a Babylonian God or an alien God. So
Sure.
at least the way they're leaving it. But,
Well,
but
I
we
mean,
know.
yeah. Frankly, even Richard Dawkins, I've heard him in interviews say that because we're a long way from explaining how life has arisen. Mind you, that doesn't mean we won't someday.
Right.
But I remember him saying, this he has this kind of possible panspermia idea that
Right.
maybe some intelligence created life, and has seeded the universe. Of course, that just pushes it back.
It does. Yeah.
But nonetheless, it is kind of interesting to hear somebody who is as ardent an evolutionist himself to even entertain that kind of idea.
Right. The second annoying item that I found is their cherry picking of scientific papers and then misinformation or misinterpretation or misrepresentation of scientific papers. And those are two very different things, but they do go hand in hand. So on the one hand, they're quick to quote this or that scientific paper that supports their pro-ID or anti-evolution argument, but they ignore the dozens or sometimes hundreds of other papers that say the complete opposite. We heard both of our guests do this, and I see it all the time in articles and bulletins posted on ID websites. So, cherry picking, and then they'll barrage their listeners or readers with technical jargon and massive amounts of details and numbers way above the level of understanding of their audience. And they frequently use glitzy videos that lull the brain into a sleepy, absorptive state. That when you sit down and watch TV, you just get in that mode where you just absorb, and that's what these glitzy videos do, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're right, and I think it hasn't changed the strategy in a sense. Hasn't the apologetic strategy, let's call it, hasn't changed all that much in my lifetime. When I first became a Christian, and I was looking for reasons to justify certain beliefs, and so, like I think a lot of people who first start on their journey of faith, I was very enthused, I guess you could say, or interested in at least the creation material. And almost all of it was basically just poking holes where they would scan the literature and find statements by evolutionists that expressed, doubt, or maybe just, well, we don't know this, or which good scientists will of course do all the time, right?
Right.
But they would string all that together and say, look, these guys they don't believe this stuff at all, and they would try to present the scientific community as being very much, in doubt over these things, which was not the case, not the case at all. In a lot of ways, the COVID situation was a reminder of that. You saw the same, at least I observed the same kind of thing going on, where some of the people who are ideologically very opposed to looking at COVID in certain ways, that's what they would do. They would cherry pick, and they would, and build these kind of conspiracy things, and it can be, well, as we saw, it can be quite convincing to people. And, but it's not a good way to promote public understanding.
Right.
That's for sure.
Yeah. And so that's the one half of what my point was there. You and I both referred to the cherry picking of studies, but then there's the other half of what I'm trying to say. They'll misrepresent the studies. Right. You did make a comment in that direction as well. I was just noticing that when they talk about genetic mutations, for example, they'll always refer to genetic mutations as degradation or devolution or detrimental, always negative connotations. And we heard that so many times from our guests. Or another way that they misrepresent often, and I'll be honest, I had to roll my eyes when this happened in our interview. They often refer to junk DNA, which they bring it up as if they were the ones to set the science world straight on this. And the fact is, at the time that Bill Dembski, one of the first ID proponents, when he first suggested that non-coding DNA might have a function, there were lots of scientists already saying as much. Nobody knew what these sequences were all about. Some of them just casually referred to it as junk because they didn't know what else it could be good for. And that's no different than people who go to a garage sale or a flea market and refer to everything there as just junk, while hundreds of other people find excellent ways to use and repurpose all of that junk, in air quotes. So pretty well everyone at the time agreed that some of that DNA, or maybe most of it, was just junk, broken genes left over after billions of years of evolution. But everyone at that time agreed that at least some of it had a purpose that we didn't yet understand. And here's the point. That drove them to look more closely at the non-coding sequences to see if they could discover some new function. And they did find all kinds of answers. But the people making those discoveries were not Bill Dembski and his gang at the Discovery Institute.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. Which brings a very basic point up, and that is, if this is science, where's the research program and where's the research, right? And I don't know of any, which is, I think, the main reason they lost the case in Pennsylvania, the famous Kitzmiller trial, because the judge basically said, well, there's no science here. Like, you haven't shown me any science, all these ideas and things, but where's the research program? Where's the data? Where's the hypotheses and those kinds of things that we do when we do science? So, back in if you go back to Galileo's day, it's interesting, the parallels and things. And of course, that trial has been highly mischaracterized. Most people think of it as Galileo against the church, and the classic science versus faith trial. It really wasn't. Really, there were scientists and there were theologians on both sides of that issue.
Both sides, yeah.
Right. And the same situation occurs with the issue of non-coding DNA, where you have people on both sides. And
so the bottom line is ID proponents have no more claim to their view of so-called junk DNA than many other scientists at that time.
Right.
And it's worth pointing out that even to this day, they'll never claim, or at least the ones among them that know a bit about genetics will never claim that 100% of the genome is functional, which you could argue they should be doing given their ID worldview. They should be saying that 100% of the DNA is intentional because it's designed, and so it must be functional.
Right.
But we know that humans are prone to scurvy, for example, and that's simply because they need to get vitamin C from other life forms, because our own gene for making vitamin C is broken, and there's lots of other examples of broken genes, which is the original intended meaning when Dr. Susumu Ono who first flippantly coined the term junk DNA. That's what he meant by that, just broken genes, and we know that we have them. But that doesn't make sense in an ID worldview.
Yeah, I wonder how much he may regret coining that term now.
Yeah.
It's interesting how in science, I guess, like in everything, certain terms or sayings or whatever will become such a focal point, become such a like junk DNA, for example, and other things like that. I think the other thing that's worth mentioning is that within the evolutionary world itself, there's debate. Like if you look at pure Darwinian evolution as it existed in Darwin's own day, doesn't really exist anymore. We have, this modern synthesis, they call it. So there's not debate in a big sense about evolution, but there's lots of debate with how does that unfold, how does that work, right, and so on. And that's healthy. And it's empirical, right? Versus just coming at it in a non-empirical way.
Okay, so that is the second thing about ID strategies and tactics that I find annoying. A third one that I can't help but notice is the misrepresentation involves a lot of hyperbole. They'll always talk about genetic mutations causing catastrophic changes, turning the organisms into hopeless cripples, references to death and species extinction. Stephen Meyer did this on Joe Rogan's podcast. Michael Behe described in our own episode, he described substitutions rendering useless the thing, even replacing parts with something a bit different, making them unable to perform their original purpose. He's obviously never watched MacGyver, or for that matter, that Tom Hanks movie, Apollo 13, where they make a square peg fit a round hole. And MacLatchie also did that with us last week. So we've talked about their God of the Gaps arguments and their cherry picking of scientific papers and the misinformation or misinterpretation. The third thing I want to say about their modus operandi is a bit more of an opinion. And I'll understand if some listeners see this as more of an ad hominem attack or mudslinging, even though my intent is not simply to insult them. I just see this as a flaw in their approach, or maybe it's a character flaw. And it's simply their persistence, which sometimes looks like it might be willful ignorance, and sometimes even outright lying. And here's what I mean. Please let me explain. They persist in raising the very same points and arguments over and over again, even though previous critics have already challenged them with the evidence against those points. That's understandable if it's a glass half empty, half full thing, but lots of times there are claims that are made, scientific claims, that have just been shown to be wrong, more than once. And it does remind me of Trump and his followers still continuing to talk about the stolen election, despite the evidence that's been given against that. It's like the anti-vaxxers continuing to talk about the links to autism, despite that being completely debunked. Or the climate change deniers, whether it be denial that climate change is even happening or that humans have anything to do with it. This persistence against the actual evidence I find just so frustrating.
Well, sure, it is frustrating. I think another aspect that helps explain what you're talking about there, the persistence and so on, is that, remember, this is an institution, right? And it's a movement. So Intelligent Design is the ID folks are a funded organization, and they have some staff that are paid, in that organization and so on. So they have to play to a certain constituency. You know what I mean? And they have to keep the machine funded, and you don't get funding usually through, at least in these kind of things, sophisticated, complicated kind of arguments. But the idea that American children are going to be turned into atheists in schools, that's a powerful thing to get people to cough up some dough. And so I do think that helps explain some of that persistence and so on, that things that would threaten the whole movement or the whole organization are going to be taken pretty seriously and either set aside or dealt with in some way to quash, because they threaten the organization. Right.
So, Scott, I do have to be honest, I wasn't happy entertaining these negative thoughts about these guys. I try not to be that way. And so I was sitting by the pond, I was trying to understand why I'm thinking these thoughts, try to see it from their perspective. And in their defense, it's probably in part a nature-nurture thing. On the one hand, the nature side of this, it's only natural. We're all human. As humans, we see agency in everything. That's been drilled into us over millions of years of evolution, getting spooked by hearing breaking twigs in the forest or a rustling in the grass. And we did an episode on that part of our human nature with Dr. Justin Barrett, a psychologist. That was episode number 78. And it's also human nature to be dumbstruck by awe. We all do it. It's just human to be overwhelmed by awe and resorting to the primitive reflex of, therefore God. We stand at the bottom of Niagara Falls. We stare up into the night sky full of constellations and planets. Or, as I did a few months ago, stand in front of a glacier or a Brazilian rainforest. And we just get this overwhelming feeling of there's something big out there. Someday I might get a psychologist to come on and talk about that human character trait of being awestruck and how that plays into our religious minds.
Yeah, absolutely. The writer Annie Dillard comes to mind, and for our listeners, I would really highly recommend you explore Annie Dillard's writings. She's you characterize her kind of a religious humanist. So
okay.
She's fully accepting of modern science and all that kind of stuff, but she's a poet and a writer, and she just her nature writing is fabulous. And that's kind of what she says, is that you just, like you sitting by a pond, right? And in fact, her most famous book is called Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, which is just an unbelievable book. And she talks about that, and she talks about her observations of nature and so on. And even with all its red in tooth and claw, there's this overwhelmingness. There's this, it seems to point to something somehow, right?
Yeah.
And I think even atheists can identify with that, that they might say, well, I don't see any purpose in it. I can't see any reason to believe it, but it does still evoke this,
Right.
And so I think, because I know some people will say, well, but the Bible says that, that God's works of nature point to him, and you guys are saying, but I think they do point to him, but not maybe in the kind of simplistic way that some would like it to be, but in that overwhelming, in that big sense, when you sit and look at mountains and you realize, or you go up in Northern Ontario and you realize you're standing on a rock that was formed at the beginning of the planet, and these mountains were one time bigger than Everest, and this is how they've worn down, that to me it is overwhelming. like the famous quote from Darwin that I can't, quote verbatim, but he talks in his famous Origin that there is a grandeur in this view, right? There is a grandeur to this, even he did not deny, in any sense. So, yeah, I don't think believing in the mechanisms of evolution takes away from that at all. In fact, for me, I find it just endlessly fascinating and even expands it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was also trying to understand this through their eyes and recognizing that it's probably just human nature. But then there's that other side of what I referred to earlier, the nature-nurture thing. I wondered how many of those ID proponents were raised on a Sunday school version of the creation story. And that shapes the way you process, how you understand life in the universe.
Right.
I grew up in that too, and it does affect the way I think. It's a subconscious thing. And as much as people will convince themselves that they've put their upbringing aside, I think it's still always there.
Yeah.
So
there's an old Irish saying, what's bred in the bone will not out in the flesh. The things that are bred in the bone, they're, and even, I don't know about you, Luke, but even as you, in your journey, kind of your intellectual journey and spiritual journey, I'm sure you still find yourself thinking in ways that are that you may not believe anymore, but you still, because they're so ingrained there, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess another aspect of the nature-nurture thing, probably more the nurture side of the equation, is the fact that we're cultural beings, and today's society is a skeptical and mistrusting culture, mistrusting of authority. They're increasingly seeing scientists as bad. And on the other hand, the internet has deceived each of us into thinking we can become our own experts. We can follow the breadcrumbs and do the homework. And we deceive ourselves into thinking we can read very nuanced scientific and theological papers, and we will be the judge about what is true or believable or makes sense. Or today's society is increasingly finding it easy to set aside widely recognized leaders and experts and replace them with experts that say what they want to hear, that whole confirmation bias thing. And so they'll listen to internet crackpots with no credentials instead of to Anthony Fauci. They'll listen to famous actors or musicians or athletes instead of to scientists and medical doctors. And they'll listen to a Michael Behe who's never worked with the flagellum, or some lone scientist in Idaho who has, instead of dozens of experts who've done so on the cutting edge for decades.
Yeah. Well, it's that old echo chamber thing again, right? We tend to read the things that reinforce what we already believe, right?
Right.
I know lots of evangelical folks, lovely folks, by the way. I'm not attacking them in any way, but that have read stuff by people like Michael Behe and Stephen Meyer and so on, but haven't read one book by Richard Dawkins or to look at the other kind of extreme end
exactly.
of it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so that just is very naive, in my opinion. But it's that echo chamber problem, that has been really exacerbated by the proliferation of the internet, which of course, pushes us in that direction.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Scott, you and I have done enough talking. I think it's time that we listen to our listeners. We did ask our private discussion group to send in their thoughts and comments and what did they get out of the miniseries, and we got more than we can use in this episode, so let's just see how far we get through this. I want to start with one that Skylar sent to us. He said a number of things, more than we can read at the time, but the second half of his message says this: it actually made perfect sense to me why ID is not and can never be a scientific hypothesis. ID uses natural phenomena and observations to infer the supernatural. Go ahead and do that all you want. It is totally outside the realm of scientific endeavor. Let's put this whole notion that ID is a competing scientific theory to bed. It is not. I will grant all day that God exists and He is evident in His creation, but that is not a thing that science can measure. That is my own brain looking for meaning in the inanimate. What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, no, those are good points. I think very good points. And one thing we haven't talked about much yet, and maybe we will be able to maybe even do an episode on, and that is kind of the whole kind of metaphysical, let's call it, or philosophical implications of the science of evolution, which is, I really think, what the crux of the issue is. That's what people are concerned about. It's interesting that nobody gets too upset about the idea of the Big Bang, right? In other words, in the area of physics, nobody gets to their knickers in a knot over that. But when it comes to biology, now you're talking about us, right?
Yeah.
And then things take a very different turn. But no, but I would really agree with Schuyler's comments that it isn't a scientific hypothesis, because you can say, okay, the idea of irreducible complexity, but then, all right, let's say it is, quote, irreducibly complex. Then how did it happen? Well, of course, their thing is full stop. It happened somehow supernaturally or by some designer. But that takes you beyond science. And I think that's why they lost the Kitzmiller case.
Right. So, Scott, why don't you read this next one from Edward?
Yeah. So Edwin writes, I'd be interested in hearing more about ID versus theistic design, or theistic evolution, I think is what he's getting at there. It certainly seems that even if there is an argument for ID, given that malevolent design and other issues, it's hard to see, quote, theistic design, or at least the Christian version of God, as the most likely, quote, designer. I believe it was Francis Crick who proposed extraterrestrial microbes, perhaps spread through meteorites, as a possibility for the origin of DNA. So there are certainly alternate explanations for ID, assuming there is any evidence for design, which is not clear. Why are Christians pushing this at all? It doesn't seem very helpful to the faith, and instead very damaging to young, impressionable Christians who are encouraged to believe this as proof of the Christian version of God and then become disillusioned after.
Right. So I agree, Scott. I think you did correct Edward in the same way that I think. Edward mentioned theistic evolution, not theistic design. That's what he actually wrote. Because theistic design would be the same as intelligent design. It just is taking it one step further by specifying that the designer is God himself. So if Edward's asking how intelligent design is different from theistic evolution, ID doesn't specifically say who or how, while theistic evolution specifies both the who and the how. By definition, the how is evolution. It's right there in the title, in the name. And the who is God because they're theistic. On the other hand, people who prefer to use the label ID, they want to appear to be operating on the same plane as secular scientists, so they don't name the who, but everyone knows they're referring to God. And they, the ID proponents, have very mixed ideas on the how God does it. Their answer to the how question can range all the way from young earth creationism on the one hand, God just designing and making everything over the course of 6 days, all the way over to old earth creationism, simply stretching the timeline out. But God still instantaneously creating and introducing new species, new designs, and new genetic sequences. That's what we heard from Jonathan MacLatchie last week. Or the ID worldview can set aside the idea of God shaping things with his voice in his hands and instead see God allowing evolution to happen in much the way that secular science describes, but allowing for the designer, God, to step in every now and then and nudge life over the evolutionary hurdles and roadblocks.
Yeah. And that seems to me to be one of the most fundamental problems with ID, is that you have this, concept that evolution kind of goes along its merry way, doing all the things that it does, some that are, good, some that aren't great. And then, but every once in a while, I don't know, it gets stuck maybe or something. And then there's some sort of intervention to create something that can't be created through natural processes, and then it continues from there. That's not a very satisfying, to me, view of things. But
okay, so that's what Edward had to ask. Nathan asked a very similar question, and here's what he wrote. I'd like to hear more about the difference between the ID movement and something like Francis Collins's Biologos. How are they different from one another? He notes that Collins is quite critical of ID, but then he asks, how are they similar? What makes the latter approach potentially a more favorable option than the former? It's quite easy to see the differences between ID and creationism, but from my very limited reading, I struggle more to see the differences between ID and Collins's Biologos. Thanks for all your work on the podcast. I always enjoy it.
Yeah, well, to answer Nathan, actually, maybe the best way is to look at the Biologos website itself, which has kind of addressed that issue. So I'll just read here from what they say on the website. ID arguments often point to parts of scientific theories where there's no consensus and claim that the best solution is to appeal to the direct action of an intelligent designer. At Biologos, we believe that our intelligent God designed the universe, but we do not see scientific or biblical reasons to give up pursuing natural explanations for how God governs natural phenomenon. We believe that the scientific explanations complement a robust theological understanding of God's role as designer, creator, and sustainer of the universe. So that's kind of a statement from them as to how they differentiate themselves. So in other words, I think you could sum it up, Luke, and correct me if I'm wrong, that they kind of believe in methodological naturalism. In other words, that science should only stick to empirical, database, data-driven explanations and not bring in anything else. But then after you've done that, so you can certainly reflect theologically on what you've learned, right? And so Biologos is happy to do that. In fact, if you go to their website, they have lots of things on there that say, okay, given, let's say, evolution or nature, what can we derive from that, in a sense, theologically? But they recognize that there's a clean separation between them. They're not talking scientifically, right? They're talking faith-wise. And so whereas ID would bring faith into the science, they're not methodological naturalists. They want to bring it into the science, and that seems to be the fundamental difference.
Right. So Nathan, if you want more of an answer, then I suggest you contact them, get the word straight from the horse's mouth, as the saying goes. Yep. So Scott, what did Nick have to say?
Yeah, so Nick says, I'd like to know what the falsification criteria are for ID. I wish Dr. MacLatchie had been pressed harder on the malevolent design question. Can we call it incompetent design, Hanlon's razor and all? His answers mostly boiled down to, quote, God works in mysterious ways, unquote, which I perceive as him not engaging that question intellectually at all. I'd also like to say thank you for actually getting some of the heavy hitters in ID to come on the podcast. There are a lot of shows out there that denigrate ID without bringing on competent proponents of the theory. And I appreciate getting to hear from the actual leaders of ID, which is, I think that Luke gets a lot of credit for that, because of Luke's credentials and because of his engagement in this whole area. He is able to get very competent people on all sides of these issues, and I can agree with this with Nick that for me it's been fabulous as well to actually interact with some. I mean, people like Michael Behe and so on, who I've read for a number of years, and to have an opportunity to actually encounter him and dialogue with him has been wonderful. And I know that we've said things on the podcast that are obviously fairly negative, but I really do believe we've tried our best, and Luke in particular, yourself, to be fair, to let them speak. We don't like it when the opposite happens, right? When they kind of, in a sense, put words in the mouth of, evolutionists. So we don't want to do that either. Right.
Well, let me begin by saying thank you. I don't think so much it's my credentials. I honestly don't. What I do whenever I contact potential speakers, I tell them about the podcast and the growth that it's showing. And I think that's what sells them. So I can't get these big names because they say, oh, he went to McMaster University. I think it's, I tell them about the podcast and how it's grown over the four years, grown exponentially, and that impresses them. And they say, yeah, I'd love to be part of that. But now to get back to Nick's question, he began asking about falsification criteria for ID. I don't know how the ID people, would answer that question, the whole idea that science needs to be testable and falsifiable. We didn't ask them this point. I think the only way to actually directly test the idea is to rewind the clock to 4 billion years ago, let time play it all over again, but this time kindly ask the designers to step aside and not influence things. But obviously, good luck with that. But there is another way to test scientific ideas, and that is to use the hypothesis to make predictions. Predictions like, in this case, prediction like, if there was a designer getting involved, then you wouldn't see clunky and awkward designs, or half-finished designs, or malevolent designs that cause misery, suffering, and death. And if you do see designs that cause misery, suffering, and death, which we do, we pointed those out many times, then you either have to reject the hypothesis, there is no designer getting involved, or you have to modify the hypothesis. The designer's incompetent, or even malevolent. But here's the problem. ID proponents get around that through an appeal to ignorance, saying that we don't know the design constraints that the grand designer has to work with. The basic laws of physics prevent the designer from coming up with what looks like a better design, just like the logic of math prevents even God from creating a square circle. And in fact, I see this becoming a fallback position for them, the ID people. It's a pat answer they keep resorting to when they get too much pushback on their design arguments. I've heard Stephen Meyer and Michael Behe resort to this pat answer. And we saw Dr. MacLatchie, or we heard from Dr. MacLatchie do the same thing in our interview with him, when I asked him why it couldn't have been possible to simply design a windpipe completely separate from the food pipe. And after proposing a couple possibilities that we debunked, his final response was,
well, I mean, I've never tried to design a human anatomy, so I don't know what the design constraints are, what other systems are possible or are more economic or efficient.
And I thought about it later. This is the exact same answer that I got from Fuzz Rana when I debated him on Justin Brierley's Unbelievable Radio Show 5 or 10 years ago. Fuzz said the exact same thing. And I think that's just taking the easy way out. It's a pat answer that's meant to just stop discussion. For me, it's the same kind of thing that Answers in Genesis teaches people to do with their critics, which is simply to ask, were you there? When you insist that humans and dinosaurs did not coexist, they'll just ask, were you there? Just to shut down the conversation. And I think this is what the ID people are now doing with the design constraints answer. And it's just too easy. As an aside, it's a bit two-faced of them, because when they're criticized for sounding too much like God of the Gap thinking, their pet answer there is to deny it because they don't appeal to ignorance. That's exactly what Jonathan MacLatchie said in our interview. And yet, appealing to not knowing the design constraints is exactly that. It's an appeal to ignorance.
Yeah, I think you've definitely uncovered a key contradiction there. And you're right. Like, I remember, when I was studying theology in that world, it was quite common for young theologians to say, well, this is a mystery, and I remember one of the professors saying, I'm not buying the mystery thing. That's just an excuse to not engage seriously with the issue. And it's not that there can't be mystery, it's not that, but it can very definitely be a very lazy way to just avoid a problem.
Right. Yep.
And I'm sure scientists listening to this, it's just repugnant in a way, because the whole scientific endeavor is to not accept that, is to say, okay, it might be a mystery today, but I'm going to penetrate this mystery and I'm going to make it so that it isn't a mystery tomorrow.
Right.
If they had said in the 18th century, well, it's just a mystery how disease spreads, but Dr. Koch and others said, well, it might be a mystery today, but we need to figure out how disease spreads, and so they come up with germ theory. This is the way knowledge has progressed, and I can understand why people like Richard Dawkins and so on do get very angry, because they see this as just really promoting ignorance and not helping to advance our knowledge and understanding as human beings. And I think it flies very much in the face of the witness we do get biblically, where we have in the Bible itself people really struggling with these questions,
Right.
And that is not seen as necessarily a bad thing. So, yeah.
Okay. So, Scott, I've got another one. This is from John, who was talking to me through Messenger. And I'll read a part of his message in a moment, but he refers to the Luca family tree. And I just wanted to emphasize that the Luca family tree is referring to the last universal common ancestor. Luca is the last universal common ancestor. So he's talking about this family tree that begins with the very earliest cell type. So he said a number of things to me, and then he said this. Jonathan MacLatchie said something really interesting near the end, that even if the whole Luca family tree were established, that still wouldn't be evidence for evolution, because God could have stepped in and directly created every time using existing genetics, including mutations and ERVs, which are just viral scars from a disease from way back when. So he says it could include these. This is, in quotes, God created the world to look old, unquote, on steroids. This is where ID will retreat to. It is unfalsifiable but completely ridiculous. And then John, in his message, he sighed. So, Scott, what do you think of this idea of God appearing to be deceptive, making everything look like it's billions of years old and derived through common descent with modifications?
Yeah, well, this is, of course, a classic. And it does remind me of the whole young Earth, old Earth thing. And it gets even more complicated than that. People say, well, did Adam have a navel, right? That classic line, and mountains could have just been created as mountains, and they would look like they're, but it's worse than that. It's worse than that, because not only did he create, mountains and so on, but if you look at geology, you see over time the change of the, so this is a really deceptive God. And how does that fit in with the biblical idea that God is not a deceiver, that God is all about truth and so on. So he deceives us into thinking that we live in a different world than we actually live in. Yeah, it's a very I hate to say, but kind of ridiculous position in my thinking. But I suppose if that's your only resort, then you have to go there.
Right. Yeah. Jonathan MacLatchie wasn't the only one to talk about God building up organisms using snippets of pre-existing genomes, and our listener John here wasn't the only one to take exception to this. Here's part of a comment from Me Crum after our episode with Michael Behe. Again, part of what Me Crum wrote there is, I definitely felt that a lot of it was just God of the gaps arguments, but it was not until the last 10 minutes or so that I realized the person had some crazy thoughts. Like God introducing new species by potentially using genetics of the previous species. I wonder if that's just a way to skim over the fossil record. But to be honest, they did basically what I thought they were going to do, and it was not very convincing to me, not even remotely convincing.
Yeah.
So he's not too impressed with this ID proposal, Scott.
No. I don't know. This is just an aside, but do we have any comments that people who were impressed, who did come away?
Well, nobody who wrote in to say that they do embrace ID, but there was a comment from somebody who's clearly pro ID who corrected me on a misstatement, and I'm going to mention that in a few minutes.
Yeah, I remember that.
But that's the only correspondence I got from what I think is a pro ID person.
Right. Okay. Yeah, and then David Meredith, he writes to us, intelligent design boils down to some things are very complex. We can't imagine how they evolved. Therefore, God. Kind of a nice little syllogism. And then he goes on to say, intelligent design seems to only be convincing to experts who have a vested interest in believing a designer was involved in evolution. That's a good sign that it doesn't deserve much respect from us non-experts. If pretty much all aviation engineers believe a particular aircraft has a bad design, apart from those engineers associated with the particular aircraft, that's a good reason to accept the consensus opinion. Yeah, that's a good point. We have such intelligent listeners, and I think that's it's a very fair point. That go ahead. And
this comment reminded me of another one that we received at our main website, the WordPress site. A comment from an anonymous member of a pro ID advocacy group. So you just asked me about that, Scott.
Mm-hmm.
They took exception to my original comment that ID proponents always refer to the bacterial flagellum, but none of them actually do original scientific work on the bacterial flagellum. And they corrected me that they mentioned that there is a scientist at the University of Idaho who does. So I owned up to that misstatement, and I did correct my comments publicly. I said that I was going to take that back, and I changed it. But the reason David's comment that we just heard reminded me of this is the fact that there are dozens, maybe hundreds of scientists around the world working on the flagellum without saying anything about ID, and we heard from 3 of them who are most definitely against ID. And then I'm reminded that there is one lone holdout out in Idaho, and that's the guy that the Discovery Institute latches onto. And as an aside, I was puzzled why this guy from Idaho isn't more vocal in the scientific community. I've never heard him speak and only heard his name mentioned third hand. So again, it's the same thing that David mentioned about the aviation engineers. If their consensus is that the plane's a bad idea, then go with that opinion.
Yeah, same kind of issue we've been talking about.
Yeah.
You find a friend and try to
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Scott, we're running out of time. We've got time for one more. I really want to read this one, and it'll be obvious why. It comes from Ian. He's posted often on our website, and he's been on the episodes a number of times. But I do want to read this from him, and he's referring to the 3 experts that we interviewed who gave us their understanding from data of where the flagellum came from. So here's what Ian wrote. I'll be honest, I was disappointed that recovering evangelicals seemed to be going down the ID rabbit hole, so I decided to give them a miss. But this episode is excellent. A thoughtful and comprehensive response. It deserves a wider audience. And several other listeners liked and loved that comment from Ian. And so first, I'm going to say thanks, Ian. It's always great to get those encouraging comments. It makes it worthwhile to do this. We both love this. I think you do too, Scott.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And we certainly don't do this for any personal gain. Nothing about this podcast is monetized, even though we've often been encouraged to do so. But all we ask is that if you like an episode, put some kind of a comment, like what Ian did here, on social media about it somewhere, and share the episode with at least one friend. And both of those will greatly help our podcast. And again, it's all that we ask in return for these episodes.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it's amazing, how the internet works. If you get posted onto something and it has a significant audience, and then, it gets posted, you know what I mean? It's if you get seen by the right people, or you get put in the right place, it can explode pretty quickly. So,
right.
For sure.
Okay, so Scott, we have gone on long. We don't have any more time, but I guess I wanted to make one last point, and that is, as so often happens, we start a series, we start an episode, which then becomes 3, which becomes a whole mini-series, and we've done it once again. I think this one has left a lot of threads hanging, loose threads, that I do want to come back to, and we're going to over the next few weeks, but it's not so much specifically about intelligent design. We're going to talk to a couple experts, people who have written and spoke on the whole idea of science denial and science education. We've got one in the works, Janet Kelly-Gray. We've talked to her, and we might have another person who's going to come at it from a very different angle. Again, science denial and science education. Because of the comments that came up in many of these interviews about the long-term evolution experiment that was referred to several times, the Lenski experiment, it often goes by, well, we thought we'd talk to the Lenski people directly. So we've got that in the works. And then there was another comment that in this case, it was Michael Behe, who suggested that secular scientists are doing the science work for ID scientists. That really struck me, and we contacted some people about that whole idea. Are the secular scientists doing the work of ID, and is it really so hard to avoid using what we call teleological language that speaks of a design or a purpose, a meaning, that kind of a thing? So that's in the works. I've already mentioned that I think I do want to talk to a psychologist about this human characteristic of awe, being dumbstruck by awe, and how that plays into our religious thinking. And maybe even, there's so many more ideas that are just loose ends from this miniseries, but we'll see where that goes. So,
yeah, well, for me to quickly sum up as well, I think that one thing that has become pretty clear to me through these episodes and also through my own study over the years is that ID, at the end of the day, as the Kitzmiller trial found, is not really, it's not science. And I understand the concerns. And that's something we haven't talked about too much, and I think we should, is that there's no doubt evolution has been used in some really nasty ways. You think of eugenics, for example. You think of the how it was adopted in the Victorian era, in the Victorian class system, and how they viewed non-Europeans, and things like that. There's no doubt that evolution can feed into some really, nasty worldviews. Yeah. And I think that's where the battle ought to really be, that it's not evolution isn't the problem. It's what we make of evolution that sometimes is the problem. Right. And that's a dialogue definitely worth having. And but as to the issue of whether you can put ID on the level of actual rigorous science, I think it's pretty clear that you can't. So next week we are excited to be hearing from Janet Kellogg and her experience with in the whole area of science education, and many more in the works, and some really interesting topics coming up. So we look forward to our continued discussion.
And keep sending in your comments. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.